I'm going to talk about in this 50 minutes or so a little bit about what are some of the risk factors we do for decision making for disease management in our row crops, our corn, soybean, small grains. A lot of these issues also can apply to forages, whether it's corn silage, questions in alfalfa as well. But I want us to think about this and process this a little differently. It's not the data, there are data. My caveat for all of the data this year is you're going to see at the end what kind of year we've dealt with in a lot of these areas with high rainfalls, how it compounds the factors or confounds the factors, I guess maybe better said. So we want to process this and build this into a sort of a logical decision-making framework. What I want to do is take us beyond just the traditional disease cycle to think what we can do and what are the management needs under the circumstance. One of the challenges we deal with in all of these situations, obviously, is the market goes up, everybody's decision-making mindset changes as the price comes back down or add tariffs in there, all of these sorts of things. We always have to be thinking with that rule in the back of our mind, how do we pencil this out accordingly? I serve as the ex officio member on the Pennsylvania Soybean Board as one example. I was at a meeting with the growers. Question came up about tariffs, so obviously the next question was, anybody know today's market price? It's like watching people pull pistols. All the phones came out, they pulled out their favorite app, they knew exactly, no, this one's 813, this one's 817, if I call so-and-so, it's this. That's how we should approach this. It's easy to stand up here and say you need to do this, this, and this, but there's a cost behind it to the relative benefit. I'm going to use examples in corn, soybean, and wheat to illustrate it because, again, this year, in some ways with wheat, it was very clear what the issue was in a lot of areas. Corn and soybean, it's a mixed bag, especially with stuff that's still sitting out in the field. I'm based at University Park State College, if you will. I've got lots of fields with lots of corn and lots of soybeans still to be harvested. We took our corn off on Halloween to take it off because we needed to. We were running 20-21% grain moisture. The issue is how do you deal with some of that, or how do you catalog that, and what does it mean as you look at some of that? And that's this last part. Always remember to expect the unexpected in some of these situations. So here, in a typical sense, here's my disease triangle, obviously, but I want to focus on us. How do we process the information and integrate it in there? What are we targeting, and how should we target it accordingly? Because we are the ones that can influence some of these factors, but we do also make some assumptions in a lot of this in terms of what it might mean. Second key point from sort of the introductory side on the plant path, you need to know in these systems, are we talking about something that has one window, one cycle of infection? So by definition, it's called monocyclic. This is going to influence a lot of what you have to do. Is it a small window? Is it a larger window? What does that mean? And it's going to vary by the crop and disease. Two best examples we can use here. One would be Fusarium head blight in the small grains. There's a very small window for that decision making. If we flip gears to white mold and soybean, which is a single cycle, that's where that window gets a little wishy-washy. How wide is it? In the previous talk, and I'll bring it up here, I was working with a grower this year. He called 5-6 times, hemming and hawing, long field history of white mold. And then on a Monday, he finally sent me an image of symptoms in the field. And my reply was simply, well, I guess it's too late to spray, in a nice way. And I tried to also give him a plug that he had high yield potential. He wasn't wanting to hear any of that. But it's hard when you're not sure how that window can be modified or impact you. On a flip side or a different note, we have diseases that give us multiple rounds of infection. This can also complicate the decision-making process because you get inundated with questions. Maybe you should come early, late. Is that window moving in that respect? This is going to be driven as much by the weather. We're going to see it with Frogeye leaf spot. We know that there's periods where you are wet, you get a lot of symptoms, a lot of infection. You get a small dry period in there, it seems like everything's healthy. You come back later, another wet period, you see symptoms again. That's going to impact how you make those decisions as well. Where do we start? And I say we here because I did confirm that Alyssa Collins, my counterpart in a lot of ways in the extension side for this, was in agreement with it. For most of the primary diseases we're dealing with in the Pennsylvania environment in these crops, we're making the simplified assumption that inoculum is not our limiting factor. What this means is we have the pathogen there. And then what can we put over the top to manage this in a proper context, in a proper way? The weather's going to drive a lot of that. This year in particular, it started raining for us in May, and it felt like it never stopped raining. Even today, I get to drive home tomorrow, potentially to, depending on the forecast, rain, snow, sleet, ice, couple inches, 8 to 12 inches, you name it, and I'm sitting here thinking, maybe I should move back to the tropics where I lived for 5 years. I didn't have to deal with this part. I didn't miss that. The heavy rains you can live with once in a while. Why is this all important? We're trying to reduce the gaps on losses. So if you were in the talk from the entomology side, you see that the entomologists are collecting data on the damage or the impact of insect pests on productivity. We do a lot of the same stuff on corn and soybean. This is at a national level. The data may be a little coarse if you look at it, because obviously it doesn't get down to a field level. It's sort of scaled to the state. It's based on calls, it's based on trials, other observations. But in the end, what we want to do is take that information and understand how do we get from what we actually see in the field to a higher yield? Can we make smarter, more efficient, more effective decisions? What can we control? What should we manage? What are we targeting in that way? So in general disease management, you can think of a lot of ways to approach this. Some is all about removing the pathogen from the system. I've already just said my assumption is it's there. It's probably going to be hard for some of these systems to just eradicate and get rid of it. If I'm working back in the tropics and some things, there's zero tolerance. First time you see it, everything's gone and all the surrounding neighbors. It's a very different economic structure to some of the tropical fruit crops as an example. Then I can focus on what I do in plant. Do I put a resistant hybrid, resistant variety? What am I targeting? How do I interpret some of that information? Can I do other things, seed treatments that protect the roots, little things like that? And finally, the therapy here is once I have the infection, what are my options for spraying? If it's contact, we know that that might be too late. Is it systemic? We have to make our decision making as a function of all of these. And ideally, we sit up here and we prophesize and we say it's all under an integrated management protocol. We do what is in the best interest of the system. That may or may not be the reality. I quickly learned I had growers who just flat out said when I got to Pennsylvania, come visit my valley if you want to see something unique. I was at a meeting. It was pounding rain I was in Perry County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Harrisburg, if you will. They couldn't hear me speak. The rain was pounding so hard on the shed. And you could feel the loaded questions coming out. Can you tell me what's going to happen more or less in my valley? And I smiled politely and said, no, because I can't. And that's one of the things. We look at different scales in some of these respects. But it's really all about understanding that. So even in those unique valleys, am I going north, south, east, west? Do I arc along the river? Do I have land that's at river bottom? Am I up on a mountain or a hillside? These can all drive some of these things. Reducing the initial inoculum is possible, but it's something it's a longer term vision and plan. And the other one is how do we slow it down if we get it out there? I actually use potato and potato blight as my favorite example for this. If I've got a really aggressive pathogen that causes infection easily and I have susceptible material, that's one of those systems that if I don't make a decision today, I probably don't have a crop in 2 weeks. Luckily, with some of the field crops, depending what we're talking about, there's a little wiggle room in that respect for what we do. So I'm going to throw this out to you as a couple ways to think about it. we have a lot of tactics we can apply in the system, but then how do we want to package them into a strategy? And that's where, if you're a consultant or you're a grower, you want to build this into different ways. I had a student who's finishing in plant science with an agronomy minor at Penn State, comes from a farm that has a lot of white mold issues. His project is simply put to build a farm level management plan. But at every step, he has to figure out how much does everything cost. It's not just saying, well, we'll throw wheat in the equation. They don't have a drill. So we know there's a cost to that. What's the value coming back if you put that into rotation? So that's kind of how we approach the strategy. Throwing this out to everybody and keeping y'all from falling asleep too quickly on me. What are tactics? What are things we can do or do we already do to reduce, whether it's disease, it could be insects, other things. What are things we can do? Who makes recommendations here in this room? Don't be shy. A few hands going up. So when a grower asks you what I should plant in terms of a hybrid or a variety, if they have a field history of a pest, what would you tell them? Okay, rotation would be one. Find the non-host. Resistant varieties. This is what fungicide, seed treatment, these are all our tactics. It's easy just to throw them out there. You probably heard the terms kitchen sink, just do everything over the top. But really what we're trying to do a little differently, and we're seeing if we can move forward, how do we optimize these into better strategies? It could be simply put to say you're in a group that is always under high risk. You really shouldn't be worried about a risk tool, risk assessment, disease forecaster. You probably have to build in a cost to control that disease on an annual basis. There might be another person who's in a group where we're in a situation, you're talking like a 1 in 10, a 1 in 15, 1 in 20 situation. Why throw all your money into this thing that doesn't impact you economically? You have more other priorities to think about. That's what this is really about at this level. This is directly from consultants and growers from multi-state, about 750 different responses. If we think about it from the logical flow chart, and this is pre-tariffs, this is pre-current prices, but the vast majority, if we start at the top three, it is all about dollars and cents. How do I maximize my profit? So how do I make decisions that allow me to be more efficient and effective? Can I do it on top of it by maximizing yield, maybe integrating different things into the equation? Where do the commodity prices fit into that? Soybean with the tariff is an easy example to illustrate. If you're $10 one week and $8 the next week, all of a sudden you go, I'm probably going to look at all of these things differently. The student who I'm working with for his farm, they're recognizing, going back to my example there with regards to making an investment for a drill, because they're a corn soybean operation. They said $6 wheat, if we can pull 100 bushel, is not a bad investment because their input cost is probably lower even with the equipment cost than $8 soybean currently and only getting 40 or 50 bushels when you figure out some of that. That's the sort of logic. Then we move into other things that are cultural tactics. Do we modify population to reduce canopy structure? Where does disease resistance fall into play? How does the crop rotation get me to a non-host? Do I have options for long-term field history? I think you saw some examples if you were in Sean Conley's talk as one situation looking at these different forms of rotations and the field history, how is it influenced? Seed price does show up. I have a feeling with the current economics for corn and soybean in particular, that might actually would be a higher response today. And then what caught me interestingly is all the things we can do during the season, our herbicide, insecticide, and fungicide program. These are straight from stakeholders who say they're important, but they're not as important as these other factors to be successful. If I do some of these other integrative ideas, maybe I don't need to do this. That's sort of the logic we're implying there. It's really important because if we look at just fungicides in this situation, and to orient everybody, because this is in dollars per hectare, on the less than 37, we're talking about $15 per acre, to the top end of around $30. Sort of the normal window we look at. What struck us interestingly with this sort of logic stratifying out by the two key stakeholder groups on the corn side is we recognize that sometimes the consultants think the growers are willing to do something that obviously they're not. All of the growers in all of these states pretty much said, you get it to me at a good price, I'd consider it, but the moment we're past $20, I'm not so sure. Whereas some of these consultants thought, yeah, they're still willing. They're probably willing in that respect. You have to know that part of that equation if you work with them or in your own operations to try to look at these plans. This is really critical when we look here. This is from October. I didn't get a chance to update it for the talk today. We're looking at around $3.70, $4 corn, mid-8s to into the low 9s, I think, right now on the soybean side, depending on it. You need to know all of these things because if we just look at break-even scenarios for any tool in some respects, here this is for fungicide, I can actually integrate the soybean into the same system. All those numbers in this matrix tell me what is the minimum number of bushels I would need just to cover this cost in these different scenarios. You've probably heard over the last day or two in various talks that you need to pencil all of these things out. I think it is really important because it's one thing. We did a lot of this work several years ago when the prices were moving this way, 12, 13, up to 15 on the soybean. When I worked at the University of Wisconsin, there was a corn grower in our Nutrient Integrated Pest Management Advisory Committee who actually said, I never thought I'd talk about corn as a specialty crop. Thinking about the vegetable side, where all of a sudden you have this buffer to make some of the decisions that you might not have already done. I don't think he's saying the same thing today, probably. So moving into corn as an example, with a focus on gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. When I got to Penn State, I spent a lot of time talking with Greg Roth, our agronomist who recently retired, about some of the sort of what is the panorama I'm getting into in these situations. How do you select the right maturity for your zone? I lived in Iowa for 9 years. That's really easy. Put a nice grid over the top of the state, draw a bunch of lines. I got nice little sections. Most of them are relatively flat. The degree day units kind of match up. Then you come to an environment like Pennsylvania as an example, and you see it doesn't just line up vertically or horizontally. It really goes with the flow, the mountain ranges, get a lot of valleys. We went with what we would term as the optimal zone 2 in our corn studies. In terms of relative maturity, we still took it off wet. Those are always sometimes the risk, especially in extenuating circumstances. Knowing the disease situation allows me to make the best selections. That's always number one on the radar. Standability in a year like this is actually a critical question that's coming up in a lot of areas, especially as we are unable to get out there, and we know we've had cannibalization of the stalk tissue. And then there's things like yield. How do you look at that and compare it? And how do you hedge your bets in a proper way by diversifying and not just throwing the same genetic material out there at everything? We also try to integrate a lot by learning from the growers in Pennsylvania. I'm spending a lot of time working with our 5-acre corn club, our soybean variety trial contest participant, to understand what practices they're doing. Are there things we can understand that are a little different? We know the yields are there. We know they rotate. You've maybe been to some talks here over how does rotation fit into that, where does it fit best. There's high use of rotation in a lot of these situations. They side dress nitrogen, make sure they get it through. High no-till use in the Pennsylvania environment. This actually helps understand what's going on maybe in terms of residue management and risk. Manure application is another way. How do you handle all of that? What does it do for the growth of of the corn plant in relation to what we might expect for disease. But what caught me interestingly, even in these high-producing environments, the fungicide is sort of a flip of a coin in terms of use with this group. Some half do, half don't. So I want to really emphasize there are other things we can think about in terms of the management, and this should be only if needed and under what circumstance does it fit best. I'm going to illustrate here with gray leaf spot. One of the challenges we're seeing with this and northern corn leaf blight is that multiple rounds of infection. So this one does have what we would term as polycyclic. We can get early infection when the environment's favorable. May not be perceived or noticed, but then as the weather changes, it kind of goes up. When we get to the tasseling stage, we talk about looking at the ear leaf as our assessment point in this situation. And then we still have a long ways to go with potential cycles of infection if the weather is favorable. What's interesting from my side of the equation is there's something going on that we see with this as well as with northern corn leaf blight, which has a very similar structure, some early infection as we have favorable weather environment and susceptible material. We start to get here that first round of infection forming, and then as the weather changes, a multiple cycle. Greg said something to me that struck me really interestingly when I first arrived. He goes, I'm getting a lot of questions about this part. And what I mean by that is this, let's say, represents our tasseling stage and we're looking for it. But the growers are actually saying all of a sudden it seems like mid-August to late August, this just takes off. Gray leaf spot does that as well. Our ag progress days last year, it seemed pretty light for disease. Within 2 weeks, all of a sudden, boom. Everything was out there. Weather was a little warmer, maybe a little more humid. Things clicked that way. We saw it again this year, even with a very different weather pattern in a general sense of the word. And this is something we're wondering, in some respects, how to integrate that into our decision-making process. The hybrid selection is really important, and you see for most material, you're focused on what do these ratings mean relative to it. My rule of thumb, honestly, if you're on a 1 to 9 scale, it doesn't matter if 1's good or 9 is good, and you're sitting smack dab in the middle. For most of these things, I go with the idea that if the conditions are favorable, you probably are going to get infected. That just means it hasn't been screened enough always in a lot of these environments. So knowing the disease to be able to target properly what is the issue is that first step always as you build that strategy. On top of it, we get a lot of questions now about windows. And I use corn here, and we'll see it a little differently in soybean and definitely differently in wheat. The optimal timing that's often described is right here as we transition out of vegetative into the early reproductive. That seems to correlate across the majority of trials as the best time for disease control. But then there's always this idea, what if we go in early? I've got a herbicide going in, I'll just add it to the tank and keep going. Maybe I knock down that early infection like we can see for gray leaf spot. I actually wonder, and I've been talking with Pierce Paul at Ohio State University about this, we get the same sort of question. Are we missing in the boat here? We still have a long ways to go, so I don't think the pre-harvest interval is necessarily the issue, but this is when all of a sudden we see some of these foliar pathogens really take off. Might we pick something out differently in that respect? And these are some of the questions we're still grappling with and how to best approach it. This is all relevant. If you're not aware, there's a website called Crop Protection Network, and I have it at the end also. Many of the extension plant pathologists are putting a lot of information in a uniform format, peer-reviewed by colleagues around the U.S., so we're trying to standardize the information that gets out there. One of the key pieces that is available is on an annual basis for corn, soybean, and wheat, or the small grains, are these fungicide efficacy charts. The ratings that go in here are based on observations, field level or otherwise, made by the experts, different extension plant pathologists, for example, about what they've seen in their environments. So are they seeing very good efficacy targeting, say, some of the things, common rust, southern rust, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. There are a lot of U's in this database as well in all three. That means it probably hasn't been noticed or seen to the degree that we would expect it to cause any loss. So that also tells us a piece of information that we can do. Very important in any of these situations is understanding the wide range with pre-harvest intervals that these different products have. Because we have this moving window question may impact us if we actually think going later might be a benefit in some of these environments. Very briefly, and not to belabor a lot of the data, I was like many people, our harvest date was only a couple weeks ago. We're still processing a lot of the data to try to get at it, but we are running more trials again between our two main research farms, myself at Rock Springs and Mannheimer at the Landisville farm with Alyssa Collins, getting back out what do we need for data in that respect. In our terms of our planting date, we push it later because we want this material to come through at the most opportune time for disease to screen these. So I've already said hybrid is your best ally. We also take hybrid out of the equation in a lot of these trials and go with susceptible material to try to get the maximum disease that we can under natural or inoculated depending on the situation. Some questions about going in early, 10th leaf stage, or at the normal tasseling R1. In this trial, primary disease, or the primary disease observed was gray leaf spot. Northern came on late. We were finding it, but it seemed to be more edge effects in a lot of ways. And we were taking some different assessments. And like I said, we harvested this to harvest it because I was afraid otherwise it'd still be out there right now in that respect. So the grain moisture was higher than I would prefer. Maybe unsurprisingly, given the weather conditions, among other things, even though we'll see in the next slide, there are some things that are intriguing for us thinking about disease control, high variation in the yield profiles. The trend seems to be there, though, with higher yields as we made the later application, but it didn't type out anything else. Sometimes there's questions about grain moisture. I think the big E, which is the last part of the talk, really controlled this factor, i.e. the high moisture content out there. Nothing was drying down. At lunch, we were talking with a producer, a couple of us at our table, and they can't get their soybean right now, let's say, under 16 or 17%. There's just nothing drying that down. Even if we had a dry day, I doubt it's going to move a whole lot. Test weights here were acceptable. In Pennsylvania, I've heard reports in the 40s to, in some situations, just around 60. But in a general sense, our grain quality has been weak that way, and we didn't see really any differences in that respect. Close your eyes, you can visualize whatever number you want here. I am a statistician also by training, so I can also tell you what do you want your data to look like? How do you want your answer? I jest here. I know it's late in the day, but key point, we see efficacy a lot of times. It's hard to get it to translate. I actually do think the later application is something we have to look on in some of these environments, including a year like this. I've highlighted a couple examples here with some of the experimental material that I think has promise. This is from talking to my company colleagues, probably still several years off in that respect. But we get a lot of control that's always hard to relate back to the yield profile, and that's something we're still trying to work on. That's why Piers, Paul, and myself, we've been talking quite a bit about this. Is there a different way we can look at this in a more proactive instead of reactionary or reactive approach? In terms of soybean, again, trying to illustrate the base we're starting from. These are examples of the regional winners in Pennsylvania soybean yield contests. They provide information about their practices. If you stare long enough and see a pattern there, I'll buy you a drink, whatever you like. Row spacing, drilled to 30s. No-till, minimum till. Planting dates, typically the mid-May and earlier. Some tweaks maybe in terms of the variety selection. Seeding rates are all over the board. We are looking at other data coming from Sean Conley's group. You know, most of the growers, I think, whatever that bag says, if it's 130, 40, 50, let's say, that's kind of the acre concept in a lot of ways. But we do see these growers trying to tweak that a little bit. High use of inoculants, some cover crops in some situations, others no. This part's a little more interesting to see. In terms of the response profile, this actually matches up data I would have had when I was back in Wisconsin at times. If there is something they're seeing, it's probably more the insecticide than it would be with a fungicide. In these trials, take it with a grain of salt. The number of trials is not that many to make a lot of inference, especially when these are driven by some of the maturity group and differences in region. But this is matching up to some other things we see in that respect. So there's not a clear pattern necessarily in this as a starting point, but we know we've got growers using a variety of practices in some ways. If you haven't seen this, and I'll make him smile, he's standing in the back. Actually, this is a very good guide that Sean Conley's group put together for growth staging, because I think on soybean, if you can't growth stage, we'll simplify. Don't spray anything, please. Just simple, especially on this side. You need to know, and I was on the phone a lot, and I think actually, Sean, you might have been on the phone with the same grower who was struggling with this part, this R1 to R3, one open flower at any node. This is kind of when we start thinking about white mold management. Or we should be thinking prior, obviously, but this is when the decision-making starts to kick in. That window shuts down at R3. So once we get into pod development, that's where we really think about the last stage for treatment. But there is some variation here in that respect. And I think in this one example with the grower, all these calls, out there looking for apothecia, the little mushroom, all of these things were going on. And all the while, if you would have just thought about his field history, high white mold incidence, simple rotation corn soybean, using more or less the same land, that's probably built up a lot of inoculum. He could have probably simplified some of that issue in some ways. On top of it, there is now, if you deal with white mold, there is an app that does come out of Wisconsin, a different group, Damon Smith's group, called Sporecaster. Does site-specific forecasting. You just, if you're in the field, you hit click, gets your GPS, and then it looks at specific practices like irrigation, row spacing, canopy closure. It has examples. And I believe it is now live online. They have a follow-up piece, another app called Spore Blaster, which integrates in the fungicide decision-making with the economics in there. So there's two pieces to the puzzle that we can look at in that respect. But we're still focused in a narrow window, and this window is different than the foliar diseases. When we get to R5, that's on the back end. So from R3 to R5 is when we're focused on things like frogeye leaf spot, among other things, brown spot, sorry. Because once we get to this phase of growth and development, we don't think there's any benefit to spray a fungicide. I also know on the insecticide side, John Tucker in Pennsylvania, we were getting a lot of questions, R6, R7, with these unique environments for some of the insects coming on late. Same sort of logic applies, though, in a general sense. It's probably too late there in that way. So we have two different windows, and this is important. I'm not going to go through a lot of this. It's there if you're interested, or I can get it to this information. Sclerotinia loves lots of things, loves lots of leguminous crops, so you have to always integrate that into the rotation. I'd rather use the app. Somebody else did the work. I don't care to be looking for these in the field. I'm not sure most people would be. And then it's figuring out when it's hitting, when it's missing, and under what situation. This just illustrates the same concept. My key point here is we're talking about one cycle in a general sense. We don't get repeating cycles of infection here. These are some of the general things we talk about for conditions in that respect. Keep in mind, again, if we're building a strategy for white mold, most varieties currently, there's no such thing as complete resistance. So under favorable environments, there is still some risk, but we know soybean can also handle some level of disease in this situation. It's not like it's just going to wilt and go down. If we move into the foliar approach, we look at frogeye leaf spot. This is an interesting one in this region. The weather this year was very favorable. We had a lot early, but then we even noticed that we saw some layers coming into the into the soybean canopy, a little dry period. It seemed like the infection went down, then it started to rain again. So it is an interesting thing that can impact how we look at the data or what it might mean if we're trying to section it. But very similar with the residue and then these repeating cycles when the conditions are favorable. The lesions are pretty distinctive to see once you get comfortable with it. Really, on top of it, we also saw a lot of Cercospora leaf blight, which is a different species of Cercospora. So all that purple seed stain you might be dealing with, you can blame it on the other one in that respect. But there are concentrations of the symptomology. So any wet-dry period, you will see differences in what you think might be happening. And that can impact what we deal with in some respects. Again, all of these can be built into just looking at the material available, the varieties, starting with what's in your best interest for disease management under these situations. I'm not touching on it here on nematodes. One of our farm grower groups in the Lehigh Valley, a high yielding area, they're getting bombarded with lots of questions about nematodes. If you looked at a map for soybean cyst nematode, you would think, what's going on? Pennsylvania has 2 finds in 1 county so far. And we have to start with something a little different even before that. So it'll be an interesting discussion I'll have in December with that group. But there are different things we deal with. And again, the ratings, you want to understand that profile for a lot of this. On top of it, same sort of guide you get for corn. We do the same thing on the soybean side. Understanding these different risks are critical because we don't have the same products targeting everything, nor is their efficacy the same if we're talking about white mold versus some of the foliar disease complex. In a year like this, we're seeing a lot of phomopsis. We get questions like that, but you can see there's really nothing of note in the chart to say that anything would be efficacious there. Again, running similar types of trials as to the corn. What we see in this respect, we had a lot of frogeye leaf spot with downy mildew, nothing unsurprising given the weather, but a ton of Japanese beetle damage. In that respect, we didn't spray for that, so that can also be a confounding factor. Lesson learned, moving from the Midwest to the east a little bit, in some respect in that way. What we see was not all that unsurprising. Incidence varied, high incidence in the untreated check, but it varied across these different products. Severity was low, though. If you really want to go to sleep, I can sit down with you and diagram what an incidence-severity relationship would look like. It looks like a big funnel. You probably need a couple drinks before you want to listen to me talk about that, though. We do see some differences in yield, and I think that is one of the things we have to look back in and try to figure out what did we miss in here, or what else might some of these experimentals, among others, be doing that we're not aware of. The year set up very well for a trial like this with the weather we had, but then we also saw some other issues come into play. In terms of the last part, this is where things do line up actually quite well for what we're talking about if we look at Fusarium head blight. Again, single cycle, very narrow window that we look at. The general recommendation is to integrate the combination of what you can do for genetics, variety selection, with the need to spray a fungicide at the critical growth stage. So I pull up here from Maryland the inoculated trials. These can help us quite extensively to figure out, okay, even under high risk, there are materials that perform much better in that respect. Now, how do I integrate it into this situation if I'm in a favorable environment? So in our trial, we don't do that per se. We have other trials where we look at this. I use this to tell you the type of year we had. So this is about not quite a month's worth of maps for the region. I started this on the date Alyssa Collins would have made the first commentary for the Wheat Scab website for Pennsylvania and some of the areas along the coast, just making reference to it. And you see within a couple days, we went from low to moderate to high, and we pretty much stayed favorable, even actually another week beyond this, I think it was. I have samples in the lab from spelt, from barley, from malting barley, from triticale, from oats that all had Fusarium at differing degrees. So these windows also, depending on the crop, were quite favorable. This was really, for us in Pennsylvania, kind of a perfect storm year. During that May 14th to about May 25th period, it rained every day, maybe but 2. And not just rain, it was a substantial amount, to the point that Alyssa and I would be communicating back and forth. Do you think we can even get out? Will we have a window to do some of this? The trial types we use: susceptible to moderately susceptible. This is a year where we didn't inoculate and everything kind of fell into place with the conditions we had. Want to point out here, we jumped through growth stages very quickly in May. So again, you have to be able to understand the growth stage concept to make some of these decisions. We were at flag leaf emergence on May 21st in the 2 locations, and we were already to 50% heading coming out here within 3 to 4 days. We got warm and wet and humid, and then we did our flowering apps all within a window of about 4 days between these growth stages. This is important because some of the newer products coming online, like Miravis, talk about a 4 to 7 day window. So if you kind of overlap these dates, this starts to make some sense with what we see with some of the results this year in a very favorable environment. The data kind of work by growth stage, though. If you start to look at it to some degree, although there not as many differences with the 10.3 to the 10.5.1. I color code this in gray. So this is the flag leaf. This is to the 50% heading. This is to flowering. If you look at these differences, you can pretty much see, even in that 8 to 9 day window, you wasted your time. We didn't have any foliar diseases, no powdery mildew, no septoria. No impact on the Fusarium infection because we still had another week to get there. So this, we see it in the dawn data. Also, we see it in the yield data that it matches up much more like the untreated check. Then we see this sort of near flowering growth and development line up much more to the flowering application, but again, these are overlapping windows in some degree with what some of these products in terms of their relative residual and efficacy allow us. So we don't see much difference among those. A little bit with Prosaro, you wouldn't recommend going in too early with something like that. Its optimal timing is at flowering, and the data suggests that. But what's interesting is we do see a precipitous drop in the mycotoxin contamination. And the data from our Landisville site, the yields were different, but the same general pattern was observed. So we saw it at both sites under very favorable conditions in that respect. Finally, to close, expect the unexpected as you're building these decision tools or ideas. I illustrate this when one of our on-farm sites. We work in about 50 plus farms in 20 counties in Pennsylvania, different trials. I pulled this off of where we catalog some of the site-specific data. Same site, one is whole year rainfall, one is from planting. So you see some different trend line matching. Take home point, that's a lot of rain. And every day I get new reports of more fields with more rain. Some are still sitting out there to be harvested. Pennsylvania and a lot of the region we are talking about more or less either record rainfall for 2018 or near record rainfall, above average. But even there, we can see there's periods with wet-dry issues. This is just, I haven't seen a combine roll in Pennsylvania in several weeks in most of our areas because we've kept getting rain in a lot of these places. Anybody who follows Penn State football probably heard they've shut down every grass lot for parking, which really created a headache on Saturday to go to the game, but it is what it is. I mean, do we chalk it up to an unusual year? there's still things we can learn, obviously, but it is something we have to catalog. So what are we seeing at the end of the season? Things that have popped up, a lot of ear rot issues, a lot of grain quality issues. This has to be cataloged in another way because, again, we were talking about targeting other pathogens with the fungicides, with the hybrid resistance. We've had perfect samples with not only these three, Diplodia, Fusarium, and Gibberella. Add trichoderma in the mix, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And there is mycotoxin concern. There's various recommendations you would build into that. But I want to point out there is a tool based out of Purdue and one large project that you can access as well called corn mycotoxins with an identification guide. It's free for different platforms, but on top of it, it also provides what are the labs that can allow testing for some of this material. Soybean, as we've come off the season, we've seen a lot of purple seed stain. We're seeing dockage issues, phomopsis, this constant humidity building up. We've had sprouting issues, among other things. I think the yield range in Pennsylvania, as an example, is from 0, i.e. not harvested, to 100 bushels. So again, a lot of factors are driving this. This is a photo from Melissa Collins just showing a seed lot. Lots of little friends in there in terms of the grain quality side, phomopsis, exposed seed, some shattering issues. Among the purple seed stain as well in some of this. So to close, what I want to highlight, you really have to pay attention and build this kind of knowledge base. You have tactics you can do, but over time you want to figure out how do I integrate these into a smarter, more efficient, and maybe market-resistant strategy. Because if I can produce an optimal crop with an optimal yield just by making tweaks that don't cost me anything extra, that should help me in the long run. This is the Crop Protection Network site for further information, a lot of this. Anybody who follows the agronomy guide we do, we are in a current update for that information. We're in review right now. And in my case, I just want to close then and say, you can bother either Alyssa or myself. We communicate back and forth because we both work in the same cropping systems in a general sense, and we field a lot of the same calls, so both of us have extension responsibilities that way, so there's options to reach out to either of us with any questions you may have. So with that, I'm going to close, and I don't know if anybody has any questions, or if you need to go, feel free, and I'll be up here for a little bit more to answer anything you have.